Okay, so here we have a proposition that Schopenhauer puts forward. He says, "The perceived world is my mental representation. I know of no sun and of no earth, but only of an eye that sees a sun and hand that feels an earth. The world which surrounds me exists only as a mental representation." Steiner has something to say about this point of view. Rudolf Steiner's response to this is found in the book The Philosophy of Freedom, in the chapter titled "The World as Percept." He says, "Hang on, this whole theory is wrecked by the fact that the eye and hand are themselves perceptions just as much as the sun and the earth. Using Schopenhauer's expression, we could reply, my eye that sees the sun and my hand that feels the earth are my mental representations just as much as the sun and the earth themselves." That the whole theory then cancels itself out is clear without further argument. So there's some key words in this exchange. Uh, the main one being the word mental representation, which is the English translation of the German word Vorstellung. The Philosophy of Freedom translates the word Vorstellung as mental picture. But I want to bring Owen Barfield into the mix at this point because he is going to be very helpful with this whole discussion between Schopenhauer and Steiner, or the problem. And he's also going to be helpful with the word mental representation, or Vorstellung. And because Owen Barfield talks about representations, collective representations, I think it's helpful, it's just simpler and more convenient to translate Vorstellung as a mental representation. At this point, one might be forgiven for being a bit confused, because after all, isn't Owen Barfield also claiming that the world is a representation? Well, for starters, Barfield is not calling it a mental representation, and he's stating quite explicitly that it's a system of collective representations. He's not interested in demonstrating that the world is entirely mental. As he says, this book is not about metaphysics. Barfield's objective is rather to simply demonstrate that the world around us is contingent on human consciousness. Whereas Schopenhauer is making quite a metaphysical claim about the nature of the world that we experience. In essence, what Schopenhauer is saying is that the representations that I perceive are representations within my mind. I know only the representations of a world in my mind. I don't know the world in itself. This is Schopenhauer's point of view. I only know that I experience, so in Schopenhauer's analogy, I am only aware that my eye sees a sun and my hand feels an earth. Rudolf Steiner's mission in his philosophy is to demonstrate that we can indeed know the world directly. And one of the ways in which he makes this argument is to first of all point out the inconsistency in Schopenhauer's thinking. Because if one remains with the argument that the sun and the earth are just representations and not realities in their own right, then one has to also maintain that one's hand and one's eye are themselves mere representations. A representation cannot affect another representation. Only the real sun can affect the real eye, and the real hand touch the real earth. So the challenge that both Barfield and Steiner seem to be setting us is to save the representations, save the appearances from two fronts. They're being attacked by two sides. One side is our naive realism, which is assuming that the trees and the animals and the earth and the sun and the planets all exist in a sort of a naive realistic way, independent of our perception. And thus we turn them into idols because we're assuming that they are ultimates. We're assuming that they exist in the same way that we assume the particles exist. So the one challenge is to save them from this idolatry. And this is what Owen Barfield is trying to do in his book Saving the Appearances. From the other side, the representations are attacked from the Kantian perspective, which is characterized by Schopenhauer in our example, which states that the appearances, that the trees and the animals and the sun, that the world we perceive is simply a representation in our own minds and has no objective validity independent of our consciousness. And furthermore, that the objective world in and of itself is unknowable to us. Steiner's entire philosophical work is to demonstrate that this Kantian view is simply wrong. This is why the criticism that was leveled against Steiner by a contemporary philosopher of his, Edward von Hartmann, the criticism was that he had reverted into naive realism. Von Hartmann couldn't conceive in what manner Steiner was describing the appearances to exist. He couldn't conceive of the relationship between thinking and the appearances. Von Hartmann couldn't imagine that his own thinking activity could be anything other than something just happening in his own head. He certainly wasn't going to conceive of thinking itself as being the objective underlying principle of existence. So at any rate, I hope that's been interesting. Thanks for watching.